Thank you. Can I ask, is the sound okay at the back? Yep. Okay. Good. I just have to hope the technology works for me today. I'm going to begin with a little bit of footage. There's no sound on there. Good. Thank you. This is the last minute of extra time in the Soccer World Cup final between Ghana and Uruguay. The score is 1-1. Ghana have a free kick deep in the penalty area, deep in the Uruguayan half. And twice the ball heads towards the net. Twice it's cleared off the line by the Uruguayan striker, Luis Suarez. The first time with his knee. The second time with his hand. And I should explain here, in case you're not familiar with the rules of soccer or football as it's known in most parts of the world, that unless you're the goalkeeper, you're not allowed to touch the ball with your hands. That's why it's called football. Of course, in American football, it's the opposite. You play the ball with your hands, and you hardly ever play it with your feet. That's why it's called football. Go figure. To take a better view of the incident here, what happened there, I like that sort of crowd footage. Better view of the incident, and you'll see that the handball here by Suarez, and following the rule book, the referee awards a penalty. There's the handball. And he gives Suarez the red card, sends him off the field. Suarez left the field in tears. At that moment, it seemed overwhelmingly likely that Ghana would convert the penalty and win the game. This was no small matter. No African nation had ever reached the World Cup semi-finals. Ghana stood on the brink. An entire continent readied itself for ecstatic celebrations. Sadly for the Africans, Asamoah Gyan's penalty hit the crossbar and the game went to extra time. It went to a penalty shootout and Uruguay won. Suarez, of course, felt terribly guilty. Here's footage of Suarez feeling guilty. when Gyan misses the penalty. You can see he's looking pretty stricken with remorse. Actually, he doesn't seem to have felt the slightest twinge of guilt. Afterwards, he boasted he made the best save of the tournament. I did it, he said, so that my teammates could win the shootout. When I saw Gyan miss the penalty, it felt great. As you'd expect, Suarez's teammates were deeply ashamed of what he'd done. After the match, they disowned him. Here's a picture of Suarez wallowing in his solitary shame. Naturally, a great debate ensued among soccer aficionados and other moralists around the world. Many were outraged that Ghana had been denied a place in the semi-final by what they saw as a blatant piece of cheating. Others denied that Suarez had cheated, pointing out that the handball had been instinctive rather than premeditated, and that Uruguay had accepted the referee's decision. The incident raises all sorts of interesting questions. Did Suarez cheat? If what he did wasn't cheating, was it nevertheless unsporting? Should we describe his action as unethical, or does that make the criticism more serious than is really warranted? This incident also offers an opportunity to reflect on how we decide and how we should decide what view to take when confronted with controversies of this sort. Now, to those of you who don't feel a strange compulsion every 4 years to spend 4 weeks of glorious summer holed up in front of a TV watching the likes of Ghana and Uruguay kick a ball about, bear with me. My purpose here isn't just to say something about sport. I hope to show how reflecting on a sporting controversy can open a window on moral controversies in general, and what I think is the best way to approach them. So let's begin by giving names to two opposing views. Two opposing views of Suarez's handball. The Odyssean perspective is named for the famously crafty hero of Homer's Odyssey. Scholars think this is a fairly good likeness. Right. Odysseans think Suarez should be praised for his cleverness. What he did might have been foolish in some circumstances, but in the last seconds of extra time in a knockout round, he has nothing to lose. If he lets the ball past him, Uruguay have lost the game and they're out of the World Cup. Yes, his red card means he won't play in the next game, but that element of self-sacrifice just adds a sheen of heroism to his deed. The Odyssean perspective admires success. It focuses on ends and doesn't worry too much about means. By contrast, what we call the Galahadian perspective is not prepared to compromise principles for the sake of achieving some end, no matter how great. To disciples of Galahad, the purest of King Arthur's knights, virtue is non-negotiable. There's an honour code that lays down what is right, and abiding by this code is always and everywhere a Galahadian's first concern. From this point of view, Suarez acted dishonourably by violating the code. Far from being a hero, he's a sinner, a moral cynic whose reprehensible methods sully the prize he secured for his team. If someone objects here that his action was instinctive, there's a simple Galahadian response. Fair enough, we won't blame him for the actual handball. Still, the honourable thing for Uruguay to do was concede the game. The goalkeeper should have presented the penalty taker with an unguarded net. That's what Galahad would have done. Which of these perspectives is preferable? I have a view on this, but my first concern is with a more basic question. How should we go about deciding which vantage point to prefer? I'm going to argue, first of all, that some of the most common attempts to defend either point of view are methodologically misguided. They are sidetracks leading to dead ends. And seeing how this is so is useful so we can stay on the main track and identify a more fruitful approach. So before outlining my own solution, let's take a look at the most common species of red herrings swimming in these waters. This is the first dead end, then, is the appeal to the definition of cheating. This is the approach favoured by just about everyone on the blogosphere who felt the need to throw in their 2 cents worth regarding Suarez's handball. And there were hundreds of thousands of them. The guiding question here is, did Suarez cheat? Underlying the question, of course, is the assumption that cheating is wrong. So if we can prove he cheated, we'll have proved that what he did should be condemned. But although the question, did he cheat, is one that occurs naturally, it will only help to resolve the issue if we have an agreed-upon definition of cheating to hand. We don't, and there are 2 reasons for this. First, the concept of cheating is surprisingly hard to define with precision. For instance, must cheating involve breaking the rules? Some kinds of cheating does do that, but not all. Tennis players who in unofficiated matches call an opponent's ball out when they suspect it may be good, they don't break any rules. They violate the code, but they don't break rules. Still, they are universally regarded as cheats. Must cheating involve some kind of deception? It often does. Sluggers using corked baseball bats, soccer players feigning injuries, marathon runners hitching rides, all seek to deceive. But not all cheating is like that. If Suarez had caught the ball and handed it to the referee, his action would have been essentially the same. Yet he could hardly be accused in that instance of trying to deceive anyone. People, though, would have still called him a cheat. So that's one problem. We don't have a precise definition of cheating. The second problem with appealing to the definition of cheating is that the concept is loaded. It's like murder or perversion. It's a pejorative term. You can't say to someone, you're perverted, no offence. Right? And you can't say to someone, you're a cheat, but that's okay. Right? That's why although Suarez and his coach and his teammates readily admitted he'd handled the ball, none of them would concede that he cheated. So asking whether or not Suarez cheated gets us nowhere. A second common approach is to appeal to a principle of consistency. Here, we're invited to compare our view of the Suarez episode with the way we regard similar incidents in other sports. For instance, Odysseans might point out that in basketball, it's standard practice for players to deliberately foul opponents, especially near the end of a game, in order to stop the clock and regain possession once the free throws have been made. Hardly anyone sees this as morally dubious. It's simply viewed as an intelligent tactic, and commentators will even call these good fouls. Galahadians, on the other hand, will point to different parallels. They might liken what Suarez did to a golfer desperately attempting to stave off defeat by kicking away an opponent's putt just before it reaches the hole. Now, if you know anything about golf, you'll know that doing this would be truly shocking. It could cost you your country club membership. You could be banned from the Vanderview golf course. It's simply unheard of. Even Gary Ostrower wouldn't do it. At least, that's what I thought when I wrote the first draft of this talk. But look at this. What can one say? I guess when Gary was an undergraduate at Alfred, he managed to avoid taking ethics. Now, as it happens, Rule 33(7) of the Rules of Golf state that serious breaches of etiquette may be penalised by disqualification, so blocking an opponent's putt in this way would never be a rational strategy. But that doesn't affect the essential point I'm making here, which is that in some sports, an action comparable to Suarez's handball would be universally viewed as outrageously unsporting. Even in soccer, there are actions that could be given a strategic justification, but which not even the hardest-boiled Odyssean would ever try to justify. A defender who rugby tackled a striker about to score could say, like Suarez, he did it to help his team, but hardly anyone would condone that. It would be regarded as naked cynicism beyond the pale. But appealing to consistency, like appealing to the definition of cheating, turns out to be a dead end. It cannot by itself resolve the dispute between Odysseus and Galahad. There are two reasons for this. First, as we've seen, both sides can equally well make the appeal. Odysseus will point to the general acceptance in basketball of deliberate fouls, provided they're properly penalised, and argue a similar attitude should become the norm in soccer. Galahad can mirror this manoeuvre. He'll argue that since deliberate fouls are considered unsporting in soccer, we should extend that view to other sports like basketball. Both sides are appealing to the principle of consistency, so that principle can't be used to settle the dispute. Second, there are different ways of being consistent. This is a subtler point, but it's really important. One form of consistency would be to recognise that different sports have different conventions and to go along with these whatever they are. From that perspective, we won't expect ice hockey players to treat their opponents the way golfers do. Rather, one consistently assesses conduct as sporting or unsporting in relation to the prevailing ethos within the sport being played, or even within the surrounding culture. So it's okay for a pitcher to physically intimidate a batter. It's not okay for a squash player to do that to his opponent, although I am sorry to report that Professor Alan Grove of the English division has been known to try this tactic. To be fair to him, he resorts to such stratagems out of desperation. And I should say without success. I guess if I ever publish this talk, I'll have to thank Gary and Alan for inspiration, right? But suppose instead of just referencing the existing norms of the sports, we judged all conduct by all players in all sports by reference to an ideal of sportsmanship, say the ideal usually found in golf. Notice I say usually, right? That would be a different kind of consistency. Yet how do we decide which kind of consistency should be preferred? Obviously, we can't appeal to the principle of consistency to decide that issue. So trying to resolve the debate between Galahad and Odysseus by appealing to principles of consistency turns out to be another dead end. Let's return to the original question. In the debate over Suarez's handball, two competing outlooks emerged, the Galahadian and the Odyssean. The question is, how do we decide which to prefer? In my view, instead of appealing to definitions or to consistency, we should ask the following question. Which would we prefer? A world in which soccer is played in an Odyssean spirit, or one in which Galahadian attitudes prevail? If we prefer the former, the Odyssean world, then we've no reason to criticise Suarez. We might even applaud him. If we prefer the latter, the Galahadian ideal, then it makes sense to criticise and disapprove of his action. Notice, my approach here is totally pragmatic. It doesn't assume there's any a priori way of judging the morality of what Suarez did. It doesn't see his action as intrinsically or essentially right or wrong. My view is we should adopt or reject moral positions according to whether we think doing so furthers our collective purposes and helps us realise our ideals. And in taking this line, I assume that our expressions of approval and disapproval can help nudge the ethos of a sport and perhaps also the culture at large towards our preferred ideal. So what do I say about Suarez's handball? Well, I think the Galahadian ideal is preferable, the ideal where competitors act honourably as a matter of course. So I think we should be critical of what Suarez did, since it pulls us away from that ideal. I also think that most people involved with soccer will agree with me on this. The question isn't one which there's been much systematic empirical research on, but I think it's reasonable to suppose that most people involved with soccer, or with any sport really, would prefer a sporting culture in which Galahadian attitudes and norms prevail. For match officials and administrators, question's a no-brainer. Matches would be so much easier to officiate if everyone abided by a strict honour code, and referees could spend less time wiping egg off their faces after video replays showed that they'd once again been duped by a piece of gamesmanship. Most players would also favour this environment. Competitors in sports, where thoroughly sporting attitudes are the norm, certainly don't seem to enjoy themselves less. On the contrary, where cheating and gamesmanship abound, there tends to be more anger, more bitterness, even occasional violence. Also significant here are studies showing that most athletes support drug testing as a deterrent against the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport. While doping isn't quite the same as pretending to have been fouled or faking injury or something, using drugs to gain an advantage obviously reflects a decent attitude, kind of whatever it takes. Now, to be fair, if you've read your Homer, you'll know that Odysseus doesn't do drugs, right? Or not usually. He generally relies on Athena rather than amphetamines to enhance his performance. But the principle is similar. Yet even those who've adopted the decent attitude usually wish things were otherwise. They'd prefer to operate in a drug-free environment if they could take drugs themselves. They'd prefer to operate in a drug-free environment, and if they take drugs themselves, they do so because they believe they have to in order to compete in a wicked world. Now, no doubt there are some players and coaches who thrive in a Machiavellian atmosphere, who pride themselves on their ruthless, unsentimental natures and relish the need for the keener wits that an Odyssean contest requires. According to them, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. According to them, nice guys, and Galahad is unquestionably a nice guy, right, finish last. Of course, as Shannon will remind us, it's not true that Galahad finished last. If you know your Arthurian legends, as well as your Homer, you'll know he actually finished first. He was the only one to gain the ultimate prize, the Holy Grail. You might say he won the cup. Right? But mythic figures don't make good counterexamples. Outside sport, too, there are people who love the cut and thrust of Machiavellian competition. Politicians like Lyndon Johnson, business types like boxing promoter Don King. These people relish operating in an Odyssean world. But we shouldn't assume they're the norm. In politics and business, as in sport, the majority of participants would probably, surely, prefer to compete in a setting where a strong honour code is in place, and you don't have to worry about other people's dirty tricks. And what about the largest group of those involved in professional soccer, the spectators? What would they prefer? Would soccer be more or less enjoyable to watch if a Galahadian attitude prevailed? Here too, some might argue that soccer played in a spirit of unblemished sportsmanship could be anemic. After all, the players that reach the highest levels are fiercely competitive individuals. If they weren't, they wouldn't have made it to the top. In a physically demanding, fast-moving, full of passion, contact sport, this intense competitiveness is not easily held in check. At times it's bound to spill over into rule-bending, rule-breaking, gamesmanship and physical aggression. Moreover, part of the appeal of soccer, as with many sports, is the drama of the game. Competitive intensity and passion fuel this drama, and some of the decidedly un-Galahadian episodes enhance it. Games have a narrative. I'm not just talking about soccer here, right? And sometimes the story is that old favourite, the battle between good and evil, with certain players or even whole teams playing the despised but necessary role of villain. The disputed penalty, the flourishing of a red card, the controversies surrounding subtle bits of gamesmanship, the pleasurable experience of hurling abuse at wicked opponents and gullible officials drain away these elements, and doesn't sport become more, it becomes more sporting, but doesn't it lose some of its colour and excitement? I admit these points have some validity. Odyssean moves have some entertainment value, and if you doubt it, take a look at a couple of examples. It's one of my favourite dives in soccer. That was pretty late. I heard the commentary on that. The commentator said, he went down posthumously. Okay. Sometimes players fake injury. was watching the... I was watching the World Series the other day, and I saw a batter hit by a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, and I thought, how would this guy react to that? You know? Yeah. This one's funny. This is on YouTube, and the theme is, if I can get it to play, she shot me. Maybe I can't get that one to play. Oh yeah, good. He handled the ball. He's pretending it hit him in the heart and made him fall over, but he actually handled it, and he got a red card and sent off. But it was definitely Oscar-worthy. This is famous. This is the great Brazilian player, Rivaldo. Great, but for one thing. You notice the Turkish player was sent off, right, for that. The referee's got no business sending them off when they can't see it, when they haven't seen what happened. Even the coaches get involved sometimes. This is a coach come onto the field to challenge a player. It was a vicious headbutt. Okay, this is my favourite. This one is subtle. Carlos, I want you to watch this closely. Ah, sorry, wrong. See it better in slow motion. That's pretty clever. So the Odysseans might argue that they enhance soccer's entertainment value, and they can probably count on tabloid editors for support. But on the other side of the ledger, a Galahadian ethos, were it to prevail in soccer, would eliminate diving for free kicks, feigning injury to waste time or get opponents sent off, underhand shirt pulling, cynical trips to blot out promising counterattacks, discreet elbows in the face, or not so discreet tackles designed to injure or intimidate. Yes, there might be a slight loss in the realm of competitive intensity, but it would be more than compensated for in most people's eyes by a generally freer-flowing game. Soccer is, after all, supposed to be the beautiful game. Moreover, Galahadian sport would offer its own sort of pleasing dramatics, the sort of heroically sporting behaviour that would follow were players' actions governed by the ever-present consideration, what would Galahad do? An incident that made the local newspapers in 2008 offers a memorable illustration of sportsmanship beyond expectations. What you're seeing... Oops, I've done it again. What you're seeing here is a softball game between the University of Western Oregon and Central Washington University in 2008. Sarah Tucholsky hit a home run for Western Oregon. It was her first ever home run. But she failed to touch first base as she ran around. And she realized this mistake. She turned back and twisted her knee very badly, so she couldn't, she was stranded at first base. Her teammates couldn't assist her because that would, that's against the rules. And the only option was to replace her with a pinch runner, reducing a well-hit home run to a mere single. So then two players from the opposing team went over to her and helped her, carried around the bases. Right. That's some volume there. Carried her around the bases. As she reached home plate, many of the spectators, many of the players were in tears at this outstanding display of sportsmanship. It's worth noting that the team that did that, the fielding team there, were eliminated as a result of that. Another widely reported example of Galahadianism came also in 2008 in the Washington High School Girls Track Championship, where the winner of the 3,200 metres was wrongly disqualified. Everyone realised the mistake had been made. So when the medals were presented, the girl who received the first place medal stepped off the podium and immediately handed it to the girl who it should have gone to. All the other girls followed suit. The second place girl handed her medal to the third place girl handed her medal to the second place girl, etc., all the way down the line. Now, some of you are thinking, yeah, these examples are from out west, where they're all love and peace hippies. And you're talking about girls who, as we know, are made of sugar and spice and all things nice. But it ain't necessarily so. Even West Coast girls can go in for the dark arts of Odysseanism. As evidence, I submit Exhibit C. This is a game between Salt Lake City and New Mexico.
Some questionable plays throughout this game. Here, Payne and Lambert fighting for position.
She's actually... This girl is a mean cookie. Watch this.
But, oh my goodness, if you're going to...
I went to see the women's soccer game on Saturday, and I'm proud to say that none of them did anything like that. We didn't win. Going back to examples of outstanding sportsmanship, some might still wonder if this sort of thing would only occur among amateurs, who play for much lower stakes. But consider the example of Andy Roddick. Not generally known for his Galahadian ways, in the 2005 Rome Masters, he was at match point against Fernando Verdasco. Verdasco's second serve was called out. The double fault would have given Roddick the match. He told the umpire it was good. His honesty handed Verdasco a lifeline, which, as it turned out, enabled him to go on and win the match. And sporting generosity, as I saw, even appears on the soccer field sometimes. Here's one example in an English Premier League game between... keep doing that. English Premier League game between West Ham and Everton. You can see what happens here. The goalkeeper suddenly goes down injured. The ball is crossed into the field. The net is empty. And the player Di Canio grabs the ball. And everyone, the entire stadium, give him a standing ovation. These examples of outstanding sporting behaviour, and many more could be cited, show that Galahadian attitudes are possible even in the heat of gladiatorial combat. They also underscore the fact, and this is my main point here, that most people enjoy witnessing sportsmanship of that order and approve of it strongly. A Galahadian ethos would not just eliminate cynical cheating, it would also make exemplary sportsmanship the norm. Had it been the default attitude, certain recent controversies in soccer would have turned out very differently. I'll mention two examples. One is this example. This is the qualifying World Cup game between France and Ireland. The player there who handled the ball is Thierry Henry, one of the great players of his generation. There, very obviously handled the ball. Because of this, the referee didn't see it. Henry ran away celebrating, and the referee gave the goal. Ireland were eliminated from the World Cup. It became pretty obvious once the replay showed, that he had handled the ball. And afterward, the game, Henry was terribly apologetic after the game. French supporters, in fact, eventually turned against Henry. The French sports minister, the newspaper Libération, and only in France, the trade union representing gym teachers urged a rematch. When Le Monde polled its readers on whether France deserved to be in the World Cup, 88% said no. Right. As I said, but what would Galahad have done? It's pretty obvious what Galahad would have done. OK, the handball might have been instinctive, but then he would have gone over to the referee and said, sorry, I handled the ball. And if the referee said, sorry, I've given the goal, then Galahad would have said to his team, we need to gift them a goal to level the scores. That's what Galahad would have done. The second most controversial incident of the World Cup was this. This is the game between England and Germany. Frank Lampard, the English midfielder, shot the ball, it bounced down over the goal line. The referee didn't see that he'd gone over the goal line. Seems to have been about the only person in the world who didn't. And England were not awarded the goal. You can see the incident. It's worth seeing the incident a little bit closer up. There's some nice commentary here as well. Oh, sorry, I keep making the same mistake.
It's over the line. Certainly looks like it. He just loops it over Neuer. Oh, it's not even close. Not even close.
Well, they didn't think it went over the line in 1966. That definitely went over the line by a yard.
Look, everybody felt it.
A huge injustice.
Don't you just...
For a revived...
Don't you just love the commentators' outrage? We was robbed. a footnote for historians. You probably heard the commentator say there, they didn't think it went over the line in 1966. He's referring to the fact that in 1966, England beat West Germany in the World Cup final with a similarly disputed goal, although I think most impartial spectators would agree it didn't go over the line then. That was one of the first games I remember watching. At the time, it seemed so natural that England were world champions. I remember when German teams came to play in England back then, the fans would sing to the tune of Campdown Races. They would sing 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup. This is a neat thing about growing old is you spend much of your life recounting stories of your childhood to people, whether they're interested or not. But at a certain age, you keep doing it and it counts as oral history. In the interest of truth, we have to concede that since 1966, German teams have won the World Cup twice and been runners-up 3 times. England have been consistently pathetic and have never beaten Germany again. But I digress. Going back to the incident, here's what the German goalkeeper, Neuer, said about it. I think the way I carried on so quickly fooled the referee into thinking the ball was not over the line. Clearly, Neuer is of the Odyssean persuasion. He knew a goal had been scored, quick-wittedly saw a chance to deceive the referee, and took it. And afterwards, he was unapologetic. From an Odyssean point of view, what he did was entirely rational, and his defenders, both on the field and in the stands, would no doubt concur. In sport, as in life, a lot depends on luck. Odysseans accept their good luck. They make gift horses. They don't look them in the mouth. In fact, one can go further. It's rational and legitimate to try to make you look, to increase the chances that things will fall your way. Neuer seems to have no qualms about fooling the officials, any more than Odysseus did about fooling the Trojans with a wooden horse. Were Neuer a baseball fan, he might even compare what he did to the subtle action of catchers known as framing. It's a way of catching pitches which, as a standard coaching manual unabashedly explains, gives the illusion to the umpire that a ball just off the plate actually crossed the plate. But what would Galahad have done if he'd been keeping goal for Germany that day? Again, I think the answer is obvious. He would have signalled to the referee the ball across the line, disdaining to take advantage of a refereeing blunder. That didn't happen. Of course, no one expected it. And in the heat of the moment, given that Galahadian attitudes are not the current default in soccer, it was perhaps too much to expect. But a few minutes later, in the dressing room, the German team assembled. Obviously, all saw the replays and knew that the score should have been 2-2. Here, they were no longer operating in the heat of the moment. Here was a marvellous opportunity to give soccer and sport in general a massive injection of Galahadian spirit. Had Galahad been giving the half-time talk, he would have instructed his captain to hand the ball to England after half-time and allow them to score unopposed, levelling the scores. The world would have been stunned, but once it grasped what would have happened, the world would, I think, have given the Germans a deafening, prolonged standing ovation. A gesture such as this would not just demonstrate what Galahadianism looks like in practice, it would also raise expectations with respect to sporting behaviour generally, while inspiring others to follow its example. Of course, it involves people acting against their own interests, but not entirely. In that case, Germany would still have beaten England that day. They were clearly the better team. And the great Galahadian gesture would have probably left the English players even more confused and dejected, since their opponents would then be outclassing them not just on the soccer field, but on the moral plane as well. Regardless of the result, the 2010 German soccer team would become a byword for sportsmanship. And to go back to the Thierry Henry handball hullabaloo, I'm sure if he could do it again, he'd actually would do something differently. If he'd have fessed up to the referee, Henry-esque would now be a synonym for absolute integrity on the playing field. France might still have qualified for the World Cup as well. But instead, in the autumn of a glorious career, he's top scorer for Arsenal and for France of all time. He found himself branded a cheat and pilloried by millions who'd formerly admired him. He was even booed by his home fans in Barcelona when he next took the field. So, how should we decide what view to take of Luis Suarez's handball? That was my question, and here's my answer. If we're convinced that soccer would be more enjoyable for everyone concerned, if Galahadian ethos became the norm, then that's a good reason to praise displays of outstanding sportsmanship, and it's a good reason to criticise anyone who employs less than honourable methods to gain an advantage. In all cases, the purpose and the rationale of the praise or the criticism we offer is the same, to help nudge the sport toward the Galahadian ideal. What about other sports? It doesn't follow automatically we should take the same line. My argument is pragmatic. I don't think we should fetishize abstract consistency. It's possible there are some sports that are more enjoyable without an honour code in place. The only example that comes to mind is all-in wrestling, which is more properly classified not as sport but as theatre, I think. So I would tentatively generalise across all sports. The eventual goal is to realise an ideal where every competitor in every sport, at every level, has an internal voice of conscience that nips the very idea of dishonourable action in the bud. A still, small voice that at all times and in every situation asks, what would Galahad do? Now, the title of my lecture is Galahad versus Odysseus, Honour Codes in Sport and Beyond. So now we come to the beyond bit, briefly. Sometimes an analysis of one debate can usefully illuminate an issue in a quite different sphere. And I hope to show how this is true in this case. There's one moral controversy that's strikingly similar to the debate over Suarez's handball. It's the debate about whether homeowners, whether it's ethical for homeowners to default on their mortgages simply because it's in their financial interest to do so. With the sharp decline in house prices that's occurred in many countries, including this one, millions of people have what are called underwater mortgages. If they're making payments on say a $350,000 mortgage to buy a house that's worth $200,000, you know two things. You know that they're not living in Alfred, right? House price. And you know that they may be better off walking away from the loan. Continuing with monthly payments is basically like borrowing 350 grand to buy a house worth 200 grand. It's like buying stock for $35 when its current market value is $20. Why would you do that? It's a bad investment. So from a strictly financial point of view, a strategic default may be the best option. That means stop paying, go and live somewhere else. As with the Suarez controversy, there are two main schools of thought here. On the one hand, there's the moralists, disciples of Galahad, who you see strategic defaulting as unethical. They say that a mortgage contract is like a promise, and it's dishonourable to break a promise for self-interested reasons, so it's wrong to renege on a contract unless breaking it is unavoidable. This, in fact, is the view taken by a majority of Americans in 2010, according to a Pew Center research. On the other hand, there are the legalists, who point out that the contract signed by the bank and the homeowner stipulates what will happen if the borrower stops making payments. Typically, in that case, the bank's entitled to foreclose on the property. To the business mentality, and many professional economists share this view, the question of whether you should strategically default on a loan is entirely a financial matter. Morality doesn't come into it. You look at the terms of the contract, you calculate the bottom line. Obviously, this way of thinking parallels the Odyssean view of Suarez's handball. There are times when it makes sense to break the rules and pay the penalty. And if the other party feels aggrieved, the appropriate course of action isn't for them to shout, it's, cheat, swindler. The appropriate action is lobby for a change in the rules. In soccer, referees could award penalty goals, like in rugby they award penalty tries. In banking, the penalties for defaulting on loans could be made sufficiently severe that it wouldn't be an attractive option. We could bring back public flogging or something like that. I think the parallel here is almost exact. Right? One side views the breaking the contract as unethical, the other side views it as a legitimate option. And here too, there's a kind of impasse, because both sides try to settle the debate in a very kind of rough and ready way, a very quick way, either by appealing to a definition, like saying, look, a contract is a kind of promise. Promise breaking is wrong. Or by appealing to a principle of consistency, showing how it's sort of roughly similar to other moral situations that we're in. But as with the Suarez controversy, these argumentative strategies don't settle the dispute, they short-circuit it. They assume there's a right way, the rightness of which can be demonstrated. The pragmatic approach that I'm advocating makes no such assumption. Instead, it just says, which way of thinking do we want to see prevail? If we'd prefer a world in which people consider honouring contracts a moral obligation, and we see that as a realistic possibility, that would be a reason for siding with the moralists, assuming that doing so would advance the cause. In upholding the honour code, we'd perhaps also be trying to discourage what we see as undesirable trends, as the ethics of the banking industry seep across our society like sewage water from a blocked-up drain. Right? If, on the other hand, we think things would be better if everyone was on the same page as the unperturbed strategic defaulters, that would be a reason for endorsing their position. And thinking that way doesn't make us cynical amoralists. We don't suddenly start looking like fat cat bankers or credit default swappers. We may simply and justifiably believe that promoting the strategic attitude, in this case, will do more harm than good. After all, thousands of people have ruined themselves and their families, using up all their savings, trying to keep up with their mortgage payments that they can't afford, perhaps because they've lost their jobs. And why? Because they feel bound by an honour code. They think they're doing the moral thing. But once they're destitute, the banks will foreclose just the same, and the people will be so much worse off than if they'd just walked away from the mortgage. So one could argue here that if strategic thinking became the default, fewer people would bankrupt themselves, sacrificing their happiness, their children's education, and other worthwhile things on the altar of abstract moral principle. And it might help level the playing field between the little folk who view defaulting as shameful and big finance who don't wear that particular moral straitjacket. A third possibility, of course, is that we decide the moralist attitude is destined for the dustbin of history, that fewer and fewer people will feel morally obliged to keep paying the mortgage. But we're kind of worried. We're worried that widespread strategic defaulting would have bad consequences for the economy or perhaps for people's moral virtue. In that case, we should urge that contracts under the law be written to make strategic defaulting unattractive. In other words, bring back public flogging or something like that. Right. I'd like to talk about other moral disputes where I think the same, what I've been saying, the analysis I've been offering could also provide insight, but obviously we don't have time for that. So I want to conclude by just saying this is the basic approach I'm taking then. In any moral dispute, whether it's abortion or euthanasia or capital punishment or whatever, the pragmatic approach asks these questions, and it has this advantage. It's inherently flexible. Right? Taking this approach avoids the rigidity of moral stances that appeal to definitions or that pride themselves on their unbending commitment to objective principles. It's inherently flexible, and this makes it well-suited to a time like now when our forms of life, including our social conventions, are in constant flux. Thank you.